all-powerful Parliamentary Joint Committee on Intelligence and Security has been asked to launch a new inquiry into the threat posed by right-wing extremists. Earlier, I spoke to the Shadow Home Affairs Minister, Kristina Kenneally, who is also a member of the Joint Committee on Intelligence and Security. Kristina Kenneally, thanks very much for your time. On the issue of white supremacists and the terrorist risk from that cohort, the government's now referred the issue to the Parliamentary Joint Committee on Intelligence and Security, of which you're a member. You'd been calling for that, so you'd welcome that outcome, surely.
Labor welcomes it. The government have made this referral. Of course, Labor was preparing to move a motion in the House of Representatives to make that referral. And 2 weeks ago, Mark Dreyfus, the Shadow Attorney General, and I wrote to our counterparts, Peter Dutton and Christian Porter, to propose such a referral. I'd like to acknowledge that Peter Dutton worked with me, negotiated over the terms of reference, and ensured that we got a comprehensive and appropriate referral regarding extremism, particularly the new and emerging threat of right-wing extremism.
He said that, Mr Dutton, that is, I think for Senator Kenneally and some others within Labor, are probably at the moment speaking from a base of ignorance at the moment in relation to what's happening in efforts against and combating extremists, and said, so I think that educative process is important, that Senator Kenneally and others can learn more about what ASIO is doing. Do you see it as an educative process?
I'd like to make two comments about those remarks from Minister Dutton this morning. The first is that there's been a great deal of consultation and consideration of the expert advice that's come before the PJCIS, as well as to me personally in my capacity as Shadow Minister of Home Affairs in preparing this referral. And part of the challenge we face here in Australia is that our prescription laws appear not to be fit for purpose to list right-wing extremist groups. We're the only Five Eyes partner country that hasn't done so. And that's in the circumstance where there are groups listed in Canada and the United Kingdom that have local chapters here, and we haven't listed them. So it's reasonable to ask why. We also know from ASIO that right-wing extremism now accounts for some 40% of its counter-terrorism work. And ASIO has acknowledged in public hearings that some of the preventing radicalisation and community work that we've done in Islamic communities can't be directly translated to right-wing extremism. So
40% is its focus. We saw an arrest made yesterday, allegations against an 18-year-old in Albury. Does this show to you, does this reassure you that they are on top of this?
Well, what I know from ASIO and from the AFP, and I can point to not just the private briefings I've received, but also their public testimony, is that they're alive to the fact that this is an increasing and accelerating threat. COVID has accelerated the threat of right-wing extremism. It's been a near-perfect environment for propaganda and radicalisation. But what we, as a parliament, have to do is determine and take that evidence and determine if our terrorism tools, our counter-terrorism tools, which have been geared toward Islamic extremism, are fit for purpose for right-wing extremism. And there is lots of evidence that because the motivating ideology does matter, that the tools that we have could be altered and changed to meet this accelerating threat.
On the prescribing of groups, though, is this an issue where its importance is overstated? Because I mean, if you've got the agencies aware of the group and monitoring the groups, that's the most important thing, surely. And it's been put to me by some experts in the field that once you prescribe a group in this space, they just change their name and morph into something else.
This is a really good question. I'm glad you've asked it, because prescription laws have a few consequences and objectives, and this is the case when the Howard government brought them in. And is that one, yes, there's a legal consequence that it gives our national security agencies legal tools they can use against the group. But it is also, and this is what was said by the Liberal government at the time, prescription is a clear message about what we as a community reject. It sends a clear message. We currently prescribe 27 groups. 26 are Islamist, one is the PKK. Of those 27 groups, there are many of them who have no presence in Australia or have very little interest in Australia, but we've prescribed them to send a clear message about what we reject. The other possible change that might work in terms of right-wing extremism, New Zealand prescribes individuals as terrorist entities. We can't do that under our laws. So New Zealand has prescribed Brenton Tarrant, the Christchurch shooter, as a terrorist entity, meaning you can't sell or pass on his manifesto, you can't use his name or image, you can't associate yourself with him in any way. Now, that might be a very useful change in the context of right-wing extremism, where they glorify individuals and their manifestos.
On that New Zealand terrorist, the Royal Commission into that atrocity said that he was radicalised in Australia in the years prior to the attack. Has our response and capacity in preventing that radicalisation improved since those events?
I'm not confident it's improved massively. I think what has improved is the awareness that our national security agencies have around right-wing extremism. But our capacity to disrupt and deter people online who are engaging with right-wing extremist groups, that's an area that the PJCIS needs to examine, because these right-wing extremist groups, some of them might operate on the dark web, but a lot of them are operating in plain sight on Facebook and other social media platforms. They're using very generally positive notions of ethnic pride or pro-family or patriotism, but they're using them in ways that subvert people and massage them and nurture a more divisive and hatred-filled view. And in the United States, Facebook has worked with the government there, and the FBI there is very alive. In the United States, the majority of terrorist attacks that they have disrupted have come from right-wing extremists. The FBI is very alive to this threat, and so they've been working with platforms like Facebook to disrupt and deter people when they're searching for certain terms or certain symbols online.
Well, we'll stay in touch on that issue, because it's a very important one, sadly not one that's going to decrease in terms of its relevance in the short term. Let's talk about a few other issues, though. Today, the Stillbirth National Action Plan has been announced here in Canberra. It follows on from a parliamentary inquiry into stillbirth, which you had a big part in, and it's an issue close to your heart. Are you comfortable with the outcome of this action plan?
Let me say, first of all, I just welcome the fact that Australia finally has a stillbirth action plan, a national action plan. That's what we need to drive a dedicated focus across all the states and territories, because 6 babies a day die of stillbirth in Australia. And that is a rate that hasn't changed in 20 years. And so the inquiry gave the first national set of recommendations. The government and Minister Hunt today has delivered a national stillbirth action plan. I have a couple of areas that I hope that the plan either addresses or needs a pathway to address, because I don't think we've quite yet nailed it. One is around stillbirth autopsies. We don't fund them in Australia. And the number one way to reduce stillbirth, in my view, sits with, well, there's 2 ways. They work in partnership. One is prevention and education during pregnancy, and one is the investigation of every stillbirth after it happens. So we need to find a way to fund stillbirth autopsies in Australia. And secondly, we cannot look past the fact that migrant women, Indigenous women and women in rural and regional communities have much higher rates of stillbirth, and that is something we have to take on and tackle. So
work to do, but as you said, a good start with the action plan in place. Now on to a less worthy issue, I guess, in a sense, the controversy around politicians' expenses. It always generates a fair bit of attention, and today Tony Burke, the manager of opposition business, has repaid $8,500 for business travel for his family to Uluru back in 2012. He did it quietly, in fact, earlier in the year. Should politicians be upfront about this in order to pass the pub test? Because it's not a great look to be doing it under, a cover of secrecy, is it?
Well, I remember this story back when it broke a few years ago, and Tony Burke spoke to it then. I haven't had a chance to speak to him today about his decision to repay the flights, but I think my understanding is that the flights were approved by the parliamentary officials, but yet he took a decision it didn't meet community expectations, and he's decided in his conscience to meet up to what he judges are appropriate community expectations. So I applaud him for that. I have to say, though, when I hear stories like this and think about the fact that we all have to be very accountable for the use of public money, I'm just going to be blunt and say, we've got Matthias Cormann flying around the world in a $4,300 an hour airplane in order for him to apply for what is essentially a private job, not a government-appointed job, and yet we still have 40,000 stranded Australians who can't get a flight back. So if I'm talking about the use of public money for flights, I would like to see the Commonwealth Government create a federal quarantine facility, use its resources, whether they be RAAF flights or sending out Qantas planes, and get these stranded Australians home. They
haven't met that target. Just to stay on that issue of Christmas, for all those, you said 40,000 still remain stranded. What's your priority heading into 2021? Is it beyond just Australians heading home? Because surely we have to start looking at other issues like the issue of foreign students and that sort of thing, given the flow-on economic impact.
So the borders closed 265 days ago. We have had the cap on international arrivals came in about 150 days ago, and about 125 days ago, Jane Halton handed the Prime Minister a report on hotel quarantine. And yet the government has not changed anything about hotel quarantine. And Jane Halton says it's not sustainable. 14 days for everyone in a hotel is not sustainable. Kieran, we need to find ways for people to be able to cross the border confidently and safely. We're going to be living with this virus for some time. Tourism, universities, and families need to have the confidence that they can get across this border.
Okay, and finally, Anthony Albanese, his leadership's been a focus of a bit of attention lately. A lot of your colleagues believe he's not cutting through. One of your senior colleagues said to me this week, compared him to Simon Crean's leadership. What do you think he needs to do to revitalise his and Labor's prospects? And, for the moment, Scott Morrison looks very hard to beat, doesn't he?
Well, the power of incumbency is a significant one during the COVID pandemic. And unless you're like, dare I say, the outgoing United States president, and you've mismanaged it so badly that the public has lost confidence in you. But across Australia, we have seen that, haven't we? Leaders who are incumbent are enjoying a great deal of confidence from the community. I have to say, during the pandemic, I'm quite pleased with how Albo has led us, because when some people might have thought we should have been more aggressive towards the government, he rightly judged that the community expected us to be constructive. And now that we are moving out of the crisis phase of the COVID, the health crisis phase, and into the economic implications, it's time to take it up to the government, and that's what Albo is doing. When you look at the issues around the Morrison pay cut.
So he can turn it around, you think?
Oh, look, I think Anthony, we know one thing, he's a fighter, and he fights for people, he fights for families, he fights for childcare. The childcare announcement from Anthony just resonates in any family you talk to. They know down to the penny how much they're spending on childcare and how much they're going to lose if they work a fourth or fifth day. The childcare calculator that Anthony's launched has helped families understand what it is that Anthony Albanese represents, which is support for working families to be able to get ahead in the economic recovery.
The Shadow Home Affairs Minister there, Kristina Kenneally.